A world of choice and control. Dr. Elara Voss stood at the edge of the observation deck, her gaze fixed on the cityscape below. Neon lights pulsed from the towering structures, their reflections shimmering on the rain-slicked streets. The year was 2788, and humanity had long since transcended the limitations of traditional reproduction. Genetic engineering, artificial wombs, and reproductive implants had revolutionized the way people conceived, bore, and raised children. Yet, despite these advancements, the question of autonomy remained a contentious issue. The technology had promised a future where every individual could choose when, how, and whether to reproduce, but not everyone agreed that such control was a gift. Elara had spent her life studying the implications of these technologies, but she had never been certain where she stood. As a reproductive biologist, she had seen the benefits firsthand: children born free of genetic disorders, parents who could conceive in their 60s, and a world where the biological constraints of human reproduction had been all but eliminated. And yet, she could not shake the unease that gnawed at the edges of her mind. Was it truly progress, or was it a form of control disguised as freedom? She had once believed in the utopian vision that the scientists and engineers had painted, a world where reproduction was no longer a matter of chance, where every child was the product of careful planning and genetic selection. But the more she studied, the more she saw the cracks in that vision. The technology was not perfect, and the ethical dilemmas it presented were far more complex than the engineers had anticipated. Some people feared that the ability to manipulate reproduction had been a world where reproduction was no longer a matter of chance, where every child was the product of careful planning and genetic selection. Would lead to a new form of eugenics, where only the most desirable traits were passed on. Others worried that the commodification of reproduction would reduce the act of bringing a child into the world to a transaction, stripping it of its emotional and spiritual significance. Elara had no answers, only questions. And as she watched the city below, she knew that the choices she made in the coming days would shape the future of humanity itself. The burden of choice. The societal landscape of 278 was a patchwork of progress and resistance, a delicate balance between the promise of reproductive technology and the unease it had sown in the hearts of many. For some, the advancements were a blessing, a means of ensuring that every individual had the opportunity to become a parent, regardless of age, health, or arguments on both sides. On one hand, the technology had given people unprecedented control over their reproductive choices, freeing them from the uncertainties that had once defined human existence. On the other, it had introduced a new kind of pressure, one that no longer came from nature but from society itself. The expectation to use these technologies to ensure that every child was the product of careful planning had created a new kind of expectation. Those who chose not to use the technology were often viewed with suspicion, as if their decision was an act of defiance against the natural order. There was also the question of access. While the technology had made reproduction more accessible for many, it had also created a divide between those who could afford the most advanced procedures and those who could not. The wealthy could select for intelligence, beauty, and longevity, while the less fortunate were left with the remnants of a system that had once been more egalitarian. Elara had spent years studying these disparities, and she had come to a troubling conclusion. The promise of reproductive freedom was not as universal as it seemed. As she watched the city below, she could not help but feel the weight of these questions pressing down on her. The technology had changed the world, but it had not solved the fundamental issues that had always surrounded the act of bringing a child into the world. And now, as she prepared to make a decision that could shape the future, she knew that the burden of choice was no longer just a personal struggle. It was a question that would define the course of humanity itself. Elara had spent years that had once been mean. The kos is non, the weight of expectation. Elara's own journey with reproduction had been shaped by the very technologies she had spent her life studying. She had been one of the first to use an artificial womb, a decision that had been both liberating and deeply unsettling. At the time, she had believed that the technology would give her the freedom to choose when and how to have a child, but the reality had been far more complex. The artificial womb had allowed her to carry a child without the physical and emotional toll of traditional pregnancy, but it had also stripped away the experience of gestation, the intimate, slow transformation that had once defined the bond between mother and child. She had never been one to take life for granted, and the weight of that realization had settled heavily on her. She had always believed in the sanctity of the human experience, in the beauty of the unknown that came with bringing a child into the world. Yet the technology had made it possible to eliminate uncertainty, to ensure that every child was born with the best possible genetic makeup. And that was the very thing that had frightened her. Her mother had died when she was a child, not from illness or accident, but from complications that had been preventable if the technology had existed then. That memory had haunted her for years, and it was the reason she had chosen to pursue a career in reproductive biology. She had believed that the advancements she had helped develop would prevent such tragedies from happening again. But as she looked back on her own experience, she could not shake the feeling that something had been lost in the process. Her own pregnancy had been a test of that belief. She had used the artificial womb, and the experience had been clinical, almost sterile. She had been able to monitor every heartbeat, every development, but she had not felt the same connection that she had imagined she would. The child had been born healthy with no genetic abnormalities, but the process had left her with a lingering sense of disconnection. She had not felt the weight of the child growing in sense of disconnection. She had not felt the weight of the child growing inside her, the slow, inevitable transformation that had once been a part of every woman's journey. And yet she could not deny the benefits. The technology had allowed her to have a child when she had once thought it impossible. It had given her the freedom to choose, to control the outcome, to ensure that her child would have the best possible start in life. But was that truly freedom, or was it another form of control? She had seen the arguments on both sides, and she had struggled with the implications of her own choices. The technology had given her the power to shape the future, but it had also raised questions that she was not sure she could answer. Was it right to choose the traits of her child, to eliminate the possibility of imperfection? And if she did, would she be robbing the child of the very thing that made them human? The unpredictability, the flaws, the beauty of being born into a world that was not perfect? These questions had haunted her for years, and as she stood on the observation deck, watching the city below, she knew that the answers would not come easily. The technology had changed the world, but it had also changed her, and she was not sure if she was ready to face the consequences of that change. The flawed promise. Elara had always believed that the reproductive technologies she had helped develop would be the key to a more just and equitable future. Yet, as she pored over the data from her latest research, she found herself staring at a contradiction that had eluded her for years. The technology was not as perfect as the engineers had claimed. There were flaws, subtle but significant, that had gone unnoticed in the early years of development, and these flaws had implications that extended far beyond the individual. Her research had focused on the long-term effects of artificial gestation, but what she had found was far more disturbing than she had anticipated. The artificial wombs, while highly advanced, had not fully replicated the complex biological processes of natural gestation. The hormonal fluctuations, the microbial exposure, even the subtle shifts in fetal development that occurred during the final months of pregnancy, these were not being fully accounted for in the artificial environment. The result was a growing number of children born with developmental anomalies, some of which were not immediately detectable but could manifest later in life. At first, the discrepancies had been dismissed as statistical noise, the result of the small number of children born through artificial gestation. But as more data came in, the pattern became undeniable. A higher incidence of neurological disorders, a greater prevalence of immune system weaknesses, and even a subtle but measurable decline in cognitive development among children conceived and gestated in artificial environments. These were not the results of a single failure in the technology, but rather a systemic issue that had gone unaddressed for years. Elara had spent years working within the scientific community, but she had never imagined that the technology she had helped refine would have such unintended consequences. The implications were staggering. If the artificial gestation process was not fully replicating the natural environment, then the children born through it were not being given the same developmental advantages as those born through traditional means. It was a paradox that had gone unnoticed for years. Technology had been used to eliminate the risks of pregnancy, but in doing so, it had introduced new risks of its own. The realization hit her with the force of a revelation. The technology was not a solution to the problems of reproduction, but a new set of challenges. It was not a utopia, but a carefully constructed illusion, one that had been sold to the public as a means of ensuring perfection, but that had failed to account for the very complexities that made human life so unpredictable and so deeply human. And yet, the more she studied, the more she saw the deeper implications of this discovery. The technology had been presented as a way to give people control over their reproductive choices, but it had also created a new form of inequality. Those who could afford the most advanced artificial gestation systems were likely to have healthier children, while those who could not afford the same level of care would be left behind. The more she studied, the more she saw the deeper implications of this discovery. The technology had been presented as a way to give people control over their reproductive choices, but it had also created a new form of inequality. Those who could afford the most advanced artificial gestation systems were likely to yield gimine, become a new kind of privilege. Elara knew that if she brought this to light, it would not be well received. The technology had become a cornerstone of the current society, and to question its effectiveness was to question the very foundation of that society. But the truth was undeniable. The technology was not as perfect as it had been made out to be, and the consequences of that imperfection were far greater than anyone had anticipated. For the first time in years, she felt a deep sense of unease, not just about the technology itself, but about the choices that had been made in its name. The world had been promised a future of control, of certainty, of perfection, but now, as she stood on the observation deck, staring at the city below, she knew that the future was not as clear-cut as it had once seemed. The crossroads of choice, Elara sat in her office, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her like an invisible force. The data was irrefutable. Artificial gestation had flaws, and the implications were far-reaching. She had spent years believing in the promise of reproductive technology, but now she was faced with a decision that could change the course of humanity. Should she go public with her findings, risking the collapse of the very system she had helped build, or should she remain silent, allowing the illusion of perfection to continue? The dilemma gnawed at her. If she exposed the truth, she would be challenging the foundation of a society that had come to rely on these advancements. The Council of Reproductive Innovation, the governing body that had overseen the Koblik with her findings, risking the collapse of the very system she had helped build, or should she remain silent, allowing the illusion of perfection to continue? Development and implementation of artificial gestation would not take the revelation lightly. They had invested heavily in the technology, and any suggestion that it was flawed would be seen as an attack on their work. The consequences could be severe. Her career, her reputation, and even her life could be at stake. Yet if she remained silent, the implications of her inaction could be just as dire. The flaws in the technology were not just theoretical, they were real, and they were already affecting the children being born through artificial gestation. If she did nothing, those children would continue to be born with developmental anomalies, their futures shaped by a system that had failed to account for the complexities of human biology. She had spent her life ensuring that reproductive technology was used responsibly, but now she was faced with the possibility that the system itself was flawed beyond repair. The ethical implications were staggering. If she spoke out, she would be challenging the very principles that had guided the development of artificial gestation. She would be questioning the right of individuals to control their reproductive choices, to ensure that their children were born with the best possible genetic makeup. But was that truly the right thing? Was it better to expose the truth, even if it meant disrupting the lives of millions? Or was it more humane to allow the illusion of perfection to continue, knowing that the system was not as flawless as it had been made out to be? Elara knew that the answer was not simple. The technology had given people the power to choose to control their reproduction in ways that had once been unimaginable. But now, she was beginning to see the cost of that control. The illusion of perfection had come at a price, and she was no longer sure whether the price had been worth paying. As she looked down at the data on her screen, she knew that the time for hesitation was over. The decisions she made in the coming days would not only shape her own future, but the future of humanity itself. The reckoning Elara stood before the Council of Reproductive Innovation, the weight of her decision pressing against her like a physical force. The Grand Chamber was filled with the most influential figures in the field of reproductive technology, scientists, engineers, and policymakers who had spent their careers shaping the future of human reproduction. Truth that progress, no matter how well-intentioned, was never without its costs. The illusion of perfection had been shattered, and in its place, a new understanding had begun to take root. At the heart of this transformation was the fundamental question that had always underpinned the development of reproductive technology. What does it mean to be human? For centuries, the act of bringing a child into the world had been a deeply personal and unpredictable experience, shaped by the complexities of biology, emotion, and chance. The technology had sought to eliminate those uncertainties, to give people the power to shape their future with precision and control. But in doing so, it had also raised a deeper question. Was the pursuit of perfection a form of control, or was it a reflection of the human desire to take charge of our own destinies? The answer, Elara realized, was not simple. The technology had given people the ability to choose, but it had also introduced new forms of inequality, new pressures, and new ethical dilemmas. The promise of reproductive freedom had not been a utopia, but a carefully constructed illusion, one that had been built on the assumption that control was always a good thing. Yet, as the Council had come to see, control could also be a burden, a force that could shape the lives of individuals in ways that were not always intended. The broader implications of Elara's work extended beyond the council chamber and into the wider world. The revelation had sparked a wave of public debate, forcing society to re-examine its relationship with technology, with reproduction, and with the very nature of human life. The some saw, but ones in council, would also be a burden. Why, the flaws in artificial gestation as a warning, a reminder that no system, no matter how advanced, was ever truly perfect. Others saw it as an opportunity, a chance to refine the technology, to ensure that future generations would not be born into a system that had failed to account for the complexities of human biology. And yet, the most profound change was not in the technology itself, but in the way people began to think about the choices they made. The illusion of control had been shattered, but in its place, a new kind of understanding had taken root. People began to see reproduction not as a transaction, not as a matter of choice alone, but as a deeply personal and complex experience, one that could not be reduced to a set of parameters or a list of desired traits. Others won in the Elara's work had not been a triumph, nor had it been a failure. It had been a reckoning, a moment in which the world had been forced to confront the limitations of its own ambitions. And in that reckoning, a new understanding had been born, one that would shape the future of humanity for generations to come. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.